It really feels like the movie Skeletons from 1997 might have been a fever dream I had, but no, oh no, it is very real. So this is going to be a very different video from the ones I have on my channel so far, but I started this channel to really yell into the void about my special interests, so I guess this development tracks. Remember when Netflix online catalog was weird? If not, there was this beautiful, strange time from about 2009 to 2014 when Netflix was obviously trying to beef up its collection of movies that you could watch instantly online. This was before their original shows took over and before Netflix and chill was a common term. They obviously wanted to expand quickly, so they did something amazing. They had some bigger movies that most people would consume, but they also purchased a whole bunch of obscure, cheap films. This was a glorious time when you could see some forgotten films, bad B-movies, and some legitimately interesting things on the online Netflix app. I saw some films that I loved, like I Start Counting, and at one point they had movies like Excalibur and Zardos. They are both John Boorman films, which aren't the most obscure, but they are fantastic in a very strange way, and not the most mainstream either. But I also saw some truly terrible movies. So terrible they were great, and I enjoyed watching them so much. My favorite example of this is the unforgettable Someone I Touched, a movie about STDs from the 70s. And this was also where I first encountered the actually good show Vermilion Pleasure Night, which is an amazing and funny Japanese late night show from the early 2000s. There was just so much to discover on Netflix back then, good, bad, and everywhere in between. It was in this environment my first encounter with a movie called Skeletons happened. I was painting and I decided to take a break from painting and watch a movie. I had watched almost all the thrillers that I thought looked interesting on online Netflix, so I was scrolling and this movie was recommended to me. The description was vague. That's another thing about Netflix around this time. The descriptions of the movies were very hit or miss. I don't remember anything specific, but some of the descriptions were really funny and almost seemed like the person who wrote it either had not watched the movie or was making fun of the movie or possibly didn't speak English. But I digress. So Skeletons was recommended to me, and I decided to watch it. What I saw made me feel literally uncomfortable, like viscerally. I cannot explain why. I only got about 10 minutes in and turned it off. I was home alone and I felt very unsettled. It wasn't scary, the movie wasn't intense, and it wasn't very good. It looked cheap and the acting was bizarre. I waited until my husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, to come home and tried to explain what I had seen. I was baffled because, just like now, I was completely unable to explain what was so weird about it. When I first watched the movie Excalibur, I had 103 fever, and that movie felt like an amazing hallucination. But Skeletons was like a bad fever dream. Kind of like a liminal space sleep paralysis dream. It felt kind of threatening. I told him we would just have to watch it for him to understand. So we put it on and we watched the entire film. There were so many moments when we would just repeat lines because the actors were delivering them so awkwardly. After we finished the film, we were speechless. When words finally came, I just said, "Did that really just happen?" That was the last time I watched Skeletons, and from that day forward, my husband and I used the term skeletons as a descriptor of when things get weird in an indescribable way. For example, the light was flickering and the wind was blowing. It felt like skeletons. So I randomly remembered this movie the other day, and I knew it was time to rewatch it because I wasn't sure if I loved it or hated it or some queer combination of these feelings. So I decided to do some investigation. So finding this movie is not super hard, but it is really difficult to find a high quality copy of it. There's a PAL DVD for $70 on Amazon and a VHS too. I don't know if my DVD player plays PAL. I should probably investigate that. And honestly, $70 seems a little excessive for Skeletons. Maybe one day I'll feel ready to invest in Skeletons, but not right now. Skeletons was released in 1997 and has no big stars other than James Coburn, Ron Silver, and Christopher Plummer. Also, the original director attached to Skeletons was Ken Russell, who I love. Russell is most famously known, I think, for directing The Who's Tommy. But my favorite films of his are The Devils, which has my favorite fictional nun in it, The Boyfriend, starring the adorable Twiggy, and my very favorite, Valentino, which starred one of my favorite ballet figures, Rudolf Nureyev. I cannot help but daydream about what Skeletons could have been if Russell had been in charge of it, but sadly he did not get along with one of the 9 or 10 producers. After Russell left the project, it was given to David Dakota. When I first saw the name, I knew he was a B-movie director and I recognized the name from somewhere. Then I looked at IMDb and his films and I realized how I knew him. Dakota not only directed but wrote Bigfoot vs. D.B. Cooper, which is not very good but still interesting to watch. I watched that movie about a year ago, actually. I had seen a few of his films. He also directed a few of the Puppet Master films, as well as another film I was familiar with called Lady Avenger. All these movies are, I'll just say, interesting. I recommend looking at his titles if you want more of a sense of the films this guy typically makes. Weird, but kind of fun and campy. The dude definitely has a type of movie he likes to make, and many of his films seem to be shirtless dudes wandering around aimlessly. But you know what? I'm happy Dakota has a type. Good for him. Okay, this is editing Ashling, and I totally noticed that I sounded like I was really down on David Dakota and that I was like really making fun of him, and that wasn't my intention at all. I think like the guy has done a lot of stuff, and honestly, his movies look like movies, which is a lot better than some directors can do. And his films are a lot of fun. And I can't believe I didn't realize this before, but he actually directed A Talking Cat, which is a movie that is so fun and I love it so much. And it's such a good, bad movie. And I would say Dakota really does excel in what he, I think, intends to do. I won't say he's the greatest director who's ever lived, but I didn't mean to make him sound like he's the worst thing ever, that I'm really down on him or making fun of him. That, not at all. I love it. It's all in good fun, but I will say, yeah, his movies are a bit interesting. They're just not the norm B horror movies. But he does do a lot of really interesting horror movies that I have enjoyed watching over the years. So I just wanted to add that in so I didn't sound too mean. Dakota has directed and produced literally, I think, 170 films, his first coming out in 1984. I can't fault him completely for Skeletons being a complete chaotic mess, because the budget was small at over just $2 million, and it was shot in just 19 days. But also apparently Skeletons was a made-for-TV movie, which I did not know before looking into it more. But a reviewer on IMDb does point out that there are F-bombs in this film, so maybe it did play somewhere else first? Who knows? So already after just a little digging, the final state of the movie Skeletons already makes a lot more sense to me than it did the first time I watched it. So for reference, the basic plot of the film is Ron Silver's character is a famous journalist named Peter Crane who has a heart attack, and this causes him to question his stressful city life in New York City. He and his family moved to a quaint small town in Maine. When they arrive there, everything seems picturesque and perfect. But slowly, the town begins to show cracks, revealing its true nature. There is a terrible murder, and Crane decides to dig deeper into the crime. But he finds out the town is full of many secrets, and people there don't take kindly to him digging around. Things get more and more ominous as Crane and his family face off against the town. Crane must decide how far he will go and what he will face to get the truth. This sounds pretty promising, right? Well, it is, I guess, kind of. I rewatched the film and I have some thoughts. Spoilers, probably, but I doubt anyone is really going to seek this movie out. This video is just kind of a way for me to come to terms with Skeleton's essence and the mark it has left on my soul. So immediately upon watching it, I was struck by how little I actually remembered of this movie. I didn't remember the beginning almost at all. The first thing I noticed was the acting. It wasn't the worst ever, but it wasn't great. Ron Silver is actually better than the only other movie I've seen him in, called Exposure from 2001, which is another one of these strange, cheap thrillers Netflix introduced me to. But he kind of seems like he is going to fall asleep in some scenes. I get that his character is used to being in the action as shown at the beginning of the movie, where he is talking to one of his writing subjects during her tense standoff with the police, but he never really emotes well enough for my taste. Of course, some of the actors in this film go the complete opposite way and overact in comparison, so Silver is not the worst the film has. The son, Ron Silver's son in the film, I guess his name is Zach. Oh my gosh, every time this character speaks, I feel my chest turn a little bit. This is probably a personal thing, but he is just really, really awkward. I don't think it's the actor's fault. I think it's more the script.
Okay. All right, that's cool.
There's a character who was supposed to have been given a lobotomy, and this actress hams it up to an obnoxious degree. yet she was one of the better characters at the same time. Such is the paradoxes of the skeleton's experience. Everything is awful, but somehow still compelling. There is also, I think, I cannot be certain about this, but an intellectually disabled character in this film. As far as I can tell, the person portraying this character does not actually have an intellectual disability. His portrayal is not the worst thing I've seen, but it's kind of insensitive, I think. It made me quite uncomfortable. I do also wish that they had given the role to an actually disabled actor, but I guess that cannot always happen, and I'm probably nitpicking here. Also, this film was made in 1997, and things were just not the same as they are now. So the writing is not very good, but I'll get into it. The Crane family arrives in the small town of Saugatuck, and the first thing I noticed, which distracted me a little bit, was, hey, this town looks a lot like Stars Hollow from the Gilmore Girls. So I had to stop the film, and yes, certain parts of both Skeletons and the Gilmore Girls were filmed on the same lot. I recognized the gazebo, but I could be wrong, maybe it's a different gazebo, but I think it's the same one. So after that distraction passed, I continued on with the movie. At first, everyone is nice in the town, but too nice, and I wondered if it was supposed to be a parody of people in small towns. Everyone is just overacting so much that it becomes a little unnerving. Things were happening, and yet I just still felt bored. The dialogue isn't the worst I've heard. I need to be clear. I've watched some terrible films in my time, so this isn't the worst I've seen. The dialogue is just kind of boring. So thankfully the pacing is not terrible in this film, and it picked up pretty quickly. I think on the second day the Cranes are in town, the local paper, that looks totally real, runs a story about Peter and his family moving to town because Peter is not just famous, he won a Pulitzer Prize. Actually, he had his heart attack the night he was supposed to receive the Pulitzer. Peter Crane suffers from main character syndrome and is a little bit of a Gary Stu. Everyone seems obsessed with him. I know that Saugatuck is a small town and that the stereotype about small town is word travels fast, but it seemed really fast. By this point, I didn't care much because things were beginning to happen. So, right after this article runs in the paper about Peter Crane coming to Saugatuck, a woman comes to his home and asks him for help. The woman explains that her son was in a gay relationship and his partner was murdered and he was being charged with the murder, but she swears he is innocent. Peter tries to tell her that he came to town to relax, but in the end he gets curious and starts to investigate. I have to admit, the movie really picked up for me here. Peter goes to the jail where the woman's son Jim is being held for the murder of his partner Chris. Peter meets a strange woman who grows yellow flowers while driving to the jail. Jim maintains his innocence and Peter believes him and decides to try and help Jim. But that night Jim kills himself in his cell, but immediately Peter knows something is not right. Now for me, I don't know why Peter doesn't get some outside help, but I guess the movie would be less interesting. And maybe Peter is supposed to be cocky, I don't know. This is where the script begins to fall apart for me. As soon as the whole town hears that Peter is looking into the case, almost everyone in the town turns on him and his family, like in one day. I know maybe that could happen, but I wish they had kind of drug out the suspense a little bit here, and maybe had things start small, and the closer Peter gets to the truth, the worse it gets. But maybe that's not possible in an hour and 30 minutes. The son is attacked at school, and Peter's wife is shunned by local women, and there is an effigy placed in their yard that evening and burned. All of this is fine, I guess, but it was obvious that the town was covering something up at that point. I think it could have been more interesting if maybe Peter was not certain of that right away, and maybe he had to do more digging to realize how many people in the town were truly against him. But I have to admit, it's dramatic and kind of fun at the same time during this sequence. Also, if I was Mr. Crane, I would have immediately sent my family away at that point. Just saying. Everyone Peter talks to at this point just kind of says cliched boys will be boys, and this town doesn't like outsiders poking around stuff. It's predictable. It would have been better if the townsfolk had held their hands a little closer to the chest. Another issue is some of the editing is very jarring. One of the most hilarious is where a deer is shot. I know they didn't have a lot of money for effects, but this was just very silly looking. There is also kind of a weird rhythm when certain characters are speaking back and forth, or during moments that are meant to be tense. I see what they were going for, but it just feels clunky at times. The cuts are a little too quick for the drama they are trying to establish. See here, for an example, I think would have been better to have a shot linger on the boy for a moment longer, then cut away. But this is not the biggest problem in the film. The largest problem by far with Skeletons is the music. There was a few moments where the music was okay, but just so many times I would get distracted by it. It sounds cheap, and this film cannot stand for anything to make it look cheaper than it already does. But that being said, the cinematography is also boring, and honestly, this film feels uncreative in the way it was put together. Another way the writing fails is at the end of the movie. During the climax of the film, Peter has found out that the strange woman he met with the yellow flowers had seen the murder of Chris and knows about the other minorities being killed in the town. She even has knowledge that the town councils throughout the history of the town have been killing people who weren't white, straight Christians. For 200 years they have been doing this. She also reveals she is the sister of the town's Reverend Carlisle. Reverend Carlisle is one of the main characters of the movie and is friendly towards Peter, but there is always something weird about him. It's palpable. Plus, he is an avid hunter and his hobby is taxidermy. His son Toby is also developmentally impaired. We find out through very obvious subtext that the Reverend raped his sister and then forced her to have a lobotomy or something, and they had a child who was quote-unquote funny. The odd woman tells Peter to look in the basement of the church, so Peter is very interested in more of what she has to say. But one of the only people left in the town who had been friendly towards Peter suddenly shoots her, and then turns the gun on Peter, the whole time babbling something about protecting the town. Peter is saved when his wife finds him and shoots the man before he can shoot Peter. So, whatever, not super creative, but not the worst thing. A little bit of a twist, I guess, but this is where the movie goes completely off the rails. It goes into full horror mode after this. When up to this point, I would definitely call it more of a thriller. I think the ending really ruins the movie, and many others in reviews I've read seem to agree with me. So Peter and his wife go to the church and end up trapped in the basement. They find a room full of taxidermied people, and all of the minorities the town has been hunting for the past 200 years are apparently turned into taxidermy by the Reverend and his relatives. The movie does set this up because Reverend Carlisle tells Peter that he learned taxidermy from his father and it was a family thing. Also, the Reverend's sister screams about the little boy who keeps animals alive when she points to him in a photo of the two of them. So this could have been a really neat reveal, but the scene just looks so bad. I mean, it looks really bad. The taxidermy people look bad too. I'm such a fan of practical effects, I really prefer them to digital most of the time, if at all possible, but these are just not it. It could have been cool if the scene was lit a little bit more dramatically, and if the camera work had been different. If the lighting had been different, I don't think it would have been so obvious how bad these dummies were. So Peter and his wife find themselves trapped in the basement. The lawyer who is going to defend the gay man Jim seemingly comes to their rescue, but then of course he also betrays them. Peter shoots him with a shotgun though, which is actually pretty well done for this movie. Much better than the deer, at least, for sure. So I don't know what I was thinking at this point. He actually doesn't shoot the lawyer. It's another person he shoots with the shotgun. But still, the shot looks a lot better. So then, all the big players in town, who are actually members of some sort of council, surround Peter and his wife at gunpoint in the nave of the church. Then, most of the rest of the town comes into the church behind him, and most of them also have firearms. Peter quotes the Bible to the Reverend and then gives a speech about how they should just hurry up and kill him. But to his surprise, the rest of the town actually fires on the town council, who we've seen throughout the film, and kills them all. They tell Peter to go and that they will take care of the mess. Peter Crane comes in as they leave the church in a voiceover, claiming that sometimes when he is sitting in his apartment with his family, he thinks of a quote he heard somewhere. It's better to be hated for what you are than loved for what you are not. Which, okay, I guess. I get what they were going for, but it kind of rings hollow because the people in the town weren't just hated, they were murdered for who they were. And I'm sorry, I just think it's a bad quote. The quote is weird. They should have found a quote that talked about acceptance or people doing the right thing, because in the end, the people of the town rebelled against the people murdering others, and they let Peter go. And the movie just ends here. That's it. That is Skeletons. I really didn't remember the ending clearly, because what I remembered was that the disabled boy Toby had been the one doing most of the killing, and Reverend and his friends were covering up for him. But that memory was incorrect. Toby does help murder people, but he's just a member of the group who kills people, not the only one. I also did not remember the human taxidermy, so I guess the movie surprised me a little. Overall, I think the message of religious people all being terrible bigots and racist is kind of overdone, even if it can be true in some cases. I also think the message of creepy town with something evil underneath is done much better in movies like the original Stepford Wives, for example. Examinations of creepy small towns are also done better in things like Twin Peaks or Wicker Man, obviously, but also in things like the series from HBO, Empire Falls, which came out in 2005. Empire Falls is not a horror film, but it deals with this topic in a lovely and heartbreaking way. Skeletons tries to spoon-feed you a message that we all need to accept each other, but it all gets muddled by using stereotypes that have been done again and again and again, and therefore falls flat. The film itself seems very confused about what it wants to be. Is it a comment on small-town America? Is it anti-religion? Is it a thriller or a horror film or both? Is it a drama? It tries too hard to be too many different things. And that led me to not taking any of whatever it was trying to say seriously. Which is a shame because I actually love films that talk about diversity and people becoming more tolerant to those different from them. I'm a big fan of quote-unquote bad media. I constantly watch cult classics, movies and shows people find to be bad or cringe. I personally love cringe as long as it's not hurting anyone. There is a real purity to a lot of these bad movies, books, and other media that most might consider terrible, but I love when things are good bad or bad good. But Skeletons is a nebulous region for me. It's not bad enough to be good or good enough to be good. It simply is. Skeletons just exists, and I have no idea why this film sticks out to me as something that basically I thought was memorable all this time, but really was quite forgettable in many ways, to the point where I completely misremembered a lot of parts of this film. So what does it mean? I don't know. Would I recommend this movie? I guess so. I can't help thinking the movie was successful because even all these years later, I did make it all the way through the film, and I didn't totally hate it, even with all the problems I mentioned. There is an atmosphere to the film that is very present, even if it wasn't exactly what they meant to portray, and there is a few scenes that actually do work well, but maybe this is just a private joke of a film I share with only myself. Have you seen this movie? What do you think of it? Do you like Ron Silver? Do you like Dakota's other films? What's a movie you have a weird relationship with? I would love to hear about any of this in the comments. Ashling out!